To stay here only. As soon as I left.
Little notes. No, you already had written. It was not.
Good evening, everyone, and let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you, also to our guests who are online. I would also like to welcome Dr. Sailesh Naik ji, who's the director of the National Institute for Advanced Studies in Bangalore. We also have with us Dr. Rasik Ravindra ji, who is a polar scientist and former director of the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research in Goa. And we have Dr. Thamban Melot, scientist G, director Polar Sciences, National Center for Polar and Ocean Research. We have Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay, who's editor-in-chief of Geography and New Delhi, but also very much a researcher and well-known commentator on climate change issues. And online, we have Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi. Do we have him online? Yeah. Who is professor and chairperson of the Department of International Relations in South Asian University. And finally, Professor Anindya Sinha, professor and head of academics in the National Institute of Advanced Studies. So welcome to all our very distinguished panelists. They are all very eminent people who have devoted lifetime to really the issue of ecology, because although we are talking about Antarctica today, really this is a part and parcel of the ecological challenge that the entire planet is in fact confronting. About Antarctica, of course, you will hear a great deal from all our distinguished scientists here. Perhaps you are already aware that it is perhaps the coldest, windiest, and the driest continent on Earth. And I was surprised to learn that 90% of all ice on Earth is actually located in Antarctica. It is the 5th largest continent in the world, and it has in various places the ice cover is as thick as 2 kilometers. That's the kind of mass of ice there. But more importantly, from the point of view of climate change, if all the ice on Antarctica were to start melting, then there might be, according to some estimates, a rise in sea level of something like 200 feet. So you can imagine how much of the Earth will go underwater if that ice cover actually starts melting. And in fact, some melting is already taking place. So Antarctica, of course, has been the subject of international concern. And we have been fortunate that there is, unlike the Arctic region, there is actually an international treaty, Antarctica Treaty, which was concluded in 1959, which states that all countries will ensure that this continent will be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become, I quote, the scene or object of international discord. But we should also acknowledge the fact that there are actually several claimants to various parts of the Antarctica, including Argentina. So this is still a live issue. Now, actually, for our event today, we were also going to have a intervention by Shri Gopal Gandhi, Life Trustee of the India International Center, but for various reasons, he's unable to be present this evening. So to begin our proceedings, I would request Dr. Sailesh Naik, our Director of NIAS, and also our Life Trustee, to please read out what Gopal Gandhi's message to this event is.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, very much. You must be knowing that India has recently taken the Antarctica bill that has been passed. And then based on that, Sri Gopal Krishna Gandhi has written an article. I will read some of the part from that his article. I read news of the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022 with surprised happiness. Its vision and commitment to protecting the planet's most precious natural legacy, the Earth's fifth largest continent, nearly twice the size of Australia, almost wholly covered by thick living ice through regulatory provisions, including punitive ones, are exemplary. The intent of this stringent bill introduced in the Lok Sabha during the last session is as broad as it can be, protecting planet Earth from the action of Earthlings. Let me escape into imagination. The krill, the penguins, petrels, cormorants, gulls, whales, and fur seals living on or around it perhaps met in emergency conclave on an icy height in what we would call January 1912. We, the people of Antarctica, the Icesians probably said, having solemnly resolved to constitute ourselves into a sovereign, ice-bound, ice-loving, ice-protecting republic, and to secure to all of us its Icesians justice, glacial, ecologic, and meteorological, liberty of residence in peace, movement in confidence, and everlasting fellowship, equality in the ownership, use, and conservation of our legacy, and to promote among us all ice-eternity, ensuring the safety of the individual and the integrity of our station in our environment. Assembly this 26th day, January 1912, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves to this resolution. But their resolution reckoned without the Earth's great citizen, the hominid, and his total hegemonic sway over the planet. As of today, 54 state parties are in pact called Antarctic Treaty, of whom 29 countries have the status of consultative party with a right to vote in the Antarctic consultative meetings, and 25 countries are non-consultative parties having no right to vote. India is among the first group. All the state parties have resolved to strive for the protection and preservation of the Antarctic environment, and in particular for the preservation and conservation of marine living resources in Antarctica. By enacting this, the Indian Antarctic Bill, India gives itself the moral right to tell the world that its policy towards the Earth-only non-human continent should be a respectful distance. Antarctica is now more than a continent in danger. It is a metaphor for the breath of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A message which is both inspiring but also a warning about how our future lies in our hands. And the Antarctica is really, in a sense, as he says, a metaphor for the whole ecological condition of the Earth. So as I mentioned, we have one lead speaker for this evening, and we have then four rather panelists who will be speaking about various aspects of Antarctica. So I have great pleasure in inviting Dr. Rasik Ravindra, polar scientist and former director, as I said, of the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research, Goa, to give us the benefit of his presentation. You have 20 minutes, sir, and then after that we'll go. Please take the floor.
I'll start in between. Should I? Your Excellency, Shyam Saranji, Dr. Shailesh Nayak, Dr. Sinha, Dr. Thamban, Sulekna Chattopadhyay, and learned audience. It's a great pleasure to be present here and speak a few words about Antarctic, which is a place that I love from core of my heart. Well, the science in Antarctic is very deeply linked to the geopolitics. In fact, most of the players, the Antarctic players, treaty player nations, they take shelter of the science as a shield to achieve whatever they want to do in their ambitions. So going back, India's endeavor in Antarctic, many people think it is 81, but it was way back in 1957, 58, when India decided to take up this issue of Antarctica as a heritage of mankind before the United Nations. And many scholars, they think that it was the India's initiative at that place that forced the Antarctic Treaty negotiators to come on one table and forget their differences and sign the Antarctic Treaty. But you remember those days of mid-50s, early 60s. It was a peak of the Cold War, the apartheid. And even in spite of all those things, the treaty was negotiated. It was signed, implemented in 1961. And the UK, Argentina, who had differences, the US and the America, that time USSR and the USA, they had differences. They and South Africa, all of these nations, they signed the treaty and it became a model how the international treaties should be. So with that geopolitical scenario, we come back to 1980s when India just took a U-turn and it decided to join the treaty, because possibly at that time we wanted to be inside a thing which is better than to sit outside and then negotiate. And then there was no going back. So from 1981, the scenario of the geopolitics has changed tremendously, as you will see. That time, the things were different. Now, of course, the China was not there. The big power that is rising now. Most of the Asian countries have grouped themselves together in a forum that is called AFOPS, Asian Forum for Polar Sciences, which includes South Korea, Japan, India, of course, China, and other countries. And they have got now a say in most of the matters which Antarctic Treaty nations sit together. So in short, Antarctica is no longer a supremacy of those 12 nations who decided to formulate the treaty. It has been joined by many more, as Shyam Sarangi said, that there are some 54 parties who have already signed to this treaty. But what is the change geopolitical scenario is, I have listed a few points over here. First is the emergence of China as a vital economic and strategic source. Second is the growing up of some of the Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, who have now a big say. And that at that time when the treaty was negotiated, nothing was known, rather very little was known about the climate change. It was only some sort of a proxy, but now it is a reality. And then the ice sheet dynamics was not as complicated as it is now. And of course, the suspense about the treaty, what is going to happen after 50 years of the Madrid Protocol, which is 2048, what happens to the treaty. So these all things are the current geopolitical scenario, which keep on harping in the mind of the people, those who speak about Antarctic. Now coming to the science, Antarctic is known as continent of the science, but we started doing science in Antarctic way back in 1981, 25 years after these 12 nations, they had started doing science. So we are in nutshell, 25 years, we are lacking behind. But the way we have caught up with the entire world, advanced world, is really praiseworthy. It is astonishing how Indian scientists have done a great wonder in those continents. And not only that, the science also has progressed. At that time, little was known about the seabed morphology. We have now the complete geophysical maps of the seabed topography. We have the satellite imageries, and we also have a great knowledge about marine biodiversity, appreciation of the ocean atmosphere coupled system. So all these things, they were practically non-existent at that time. So how have we kept the pace with the changing scenario? And we have kept up with the advanced nations. That is really a story to be told to all of you. Most of these countries, they have got a very strong public awareness system, wherein they try to educate their younger people or the laymen about what is Antarctica and what Antarctica should be, so that the environmental aspects of this continent are taken care of. If you go back to our journey, right from 1981 to present, say 40 years of the journey, you'll find that 1981, when our first Antarctic expedition came back, none other than Mrs. Gandhi, as you can see over here, she congratulated the team, and then a very, very little reconnaissance report was published. But immediately after that, in about 30 years after that, in 2011, we concised the entire development of the science, and we brought out a very big issue of the Geological Society of India, highlighting what India has done in 30 years, in 3 decades in Antarctic. And very recently, in 2021, an international publication has come up celebrating the 40 years of India's development in the Antarctica. So these are some snapshots of what we are doing in the raising the public awareness about the polar regions. And most of the good thing is that now P also stands for penguin for the nursery class students or for the KG classes. So this was not known earlier. There has been a sea change in our understanding of Antarctic and the popularity that this continent has gained. You can see the different languages. It is Bengali, it is English. There are also in Hindi. Many publications have come up for the laymen of India. Now, speaking in short about the journey of India in Antarctic, you can see on this map, we are practically everywhere in Antarctic. If you can, do you have a pointer? You can start from the north. We have the Drowning Moorland. We are right in the north, where our station is there. Then in the eastern side, we have no, it doesn't work. Okay. Yeah. Our main station, Maitri, is located over here. Then we have a second station in the Prince Elizabeth Land over here, Lasman Hills. This entire stretch is called as Prince Elizabeth Land. We also had an expedition in the Weddell Sea. We had an expedition to the South Pole. We also had sent a team to the Weddell Sea area. So practically, Indians have been everywhere in Antarctic. In the last 40 years, right from the periphery of the Antarctic coastal areas, we have one Dakshin Gangotri, we have Maitri, we have Lasman, we went to South Pole and all these areas. So, and on the other side, you can see our stations over there. This is Dakshin Gangotri, this is Maitri, and this is the new station, Bharti. And these are the snapshots of the areas where we are working in Antarctica. And this is the main area, Schumacher Oasis, as it is called, where we have been working for the last 40 years. Why Antarctica is important? The reason is that this is the center state of the entire Gondwana land configuration. If you can see over here, you can appreciate that Antarctica lies in the center. And then you have Australia, you have South Africa, you have America, and all those continents linked together to this. And this is not the story of only last 200 years. This has been happening repeatedly, whether it was Colombia, it was Rhodesia, it was Gondwana. So right from 800 million years till present 200 million years, we have seen amalgamation of the continents, we have seen fragmentation of the continents, but the Antarctic has remained in the center stage of all these things. And most of the Indian scientists have been working on the detailed geological mapping of all these coastal mountain chains, starting from one side, which is 15 degrees longitude, because names will not matter to you. This is Gruber, this is Peterman, this is Humboldt, and like that. There are several mountain ranges, and an area of about 20,000 square kilometers has been mapped in the last 30 years or so by the Indian geologists from various organizations. And see, the achievements have been many. These are the maps which have been prepared and distributed throughout the SCAR countries. The map of the Schumacher, map of the Orvin, these are all the names. And these are all the organizations which have been working and contributing to this great knowledge of the geological investigations in the Antarctic continent. Our main interest, is because, as I said, Antarctica lies in the center and India is very close to this. If you see this India, the map of the India over here, and we have two prominent fractures or grabens, one is the Mahanadi graben, the other is the Godavari graben, and you can find the continuation of these in the Eastern Antarctic cratonic area. This is the Lambert Glacier over here, and you can find that the rock types match, whether they are the Archean rock types which form the basement, you can find them here. Then you have the Proterozoic rocks, which are about 500 million years old. You find them in Antarctic, you find them also in the Eastern Ghat mobile belt, and surprisingly, you have some Permian sediments which are present in the Lambert graben and also present in the Mahanadi. So this is a very strong evidence that once, about 200 million years back, the India and the Antarctica, they were close together. And most of the efforts of the Indian scientists have been concentrating on this issue, that what was the relative position of India with Antarctic and with other continents, whether it was Mozambique or it was some other areas. So this has been the major thrust area of our work. This unfortunately doesn't work over here. So I'll now come to a year which was 2014, and the SCAR, that is the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which is the main scientific body which looks after the scientific issues or scientific management of Antarctic. They had a horizon scan wherein they invited scientists from all over the world, about 80, and in fact, Dr. Shailesh Nayak was there. And then they asked pertaining questions to Antarctic. That was the most prominent questions, and about 80 such questions were asked, and then these questions were shortlisted, and 6 questions were finally selected. And this also came up in a Nature publication. And it is based on these 6 questions that we can see what is the contemporary science that the entire world is doing and what India is doing with respect to these 6 questions. So I have divided my talk now only concentrating to these 6 questions. So I may be not covering all the aspects of the science, but these 6 points are very relevant, and you'll see that India has not been back in any of these 6 points. We have done wonderful work, and all this work has been published in the top-ranking peer-reviewed journals of the world. Coming to the first issue, that was the global reach. What is the atmospheric linkages of Antarctic with India and other Indian summer monsoons? There was a joint Indo-Norwegian research project that NCR took up, and the result of that was that there is an inter-hemispheric teleconnection and their influence on the climate during the last 11,700 years, that is the Holocene, with special focus in the last 2,000 years. So this particular project is over, and it has been shown that the Antarctic and Southern Ocean temperature, it affects the Indian summer monsoon. So this is a very, very strong deduction for the benefit of the Indian summer monsoon, which as you know, is the lifeline of India. A warmer Antarctica and mid-latitudes of the Southern Ocean weakens the monsoon, while a cooler Antarctic and Southern Ocean's mid-latitude result in a stronger monsoon. So this paper was published. I'm not going on this detail because Dr. Thamban is going to speak in large on this, the climate of the Antarctic. The ice core drilling was a major feature of Indian expeditions to Antarctic. We have been doing ice coring for the last about 10 years or so, and recently, again, under Dr. Thamban's leadership, NCR has been doing the ice coring. This was one of the earlier 2 cores which were drilled in the ice shelf area And these names were given depending upon the serial. That was India 25B5 and India 22B4. These two boreholes were drilled in the Antarctic ice sheet. I'll show you where that area was. And it has been very clearly shown that the temperature gradient, as you can see, there's a very good correlation between the oxygen isotope ratio, the hydrogen isotope, and the rise of the temperature. And all this is reduced from these ice cores, which have been raised and studied in NCR over here. Now here you can see this is a ice sheet, and this is a Schumacher oasis. Our station is located over here. This is the ice shelf. Now these ice shelves, they buttress the ice sheets. If these are not there, ice shelf is not there, the entire ice sheet will go to the ocean and it will be lost. And in some places, these mountains, they put up a barrier, so they stop the ice sheet to go down. This is one such example over here. This is also the ice sheet, and this is another example. This is where the ice sheet goes to the ocean directly. The MAD ice was a project which again was taken up with the international collaboration. This is the Nielsen ice shelf. Dr. Thamban will speak on detail. But the major findings were the ice shelf front facing the ocean may melt from base in the future as the sea ice cover diminishes, and more alarmingly, the snowfall rates have significantly reduced since 1980s. That means there is some sort of a relationship between the ice loss that takes place in the sea and the ice which gets accumulated in the ice shelf. Schumacher has been the area of where maximum work has been done by the Indian scientists. And this is the range, Schumacher range. This is practically 14 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide. And these are some of the glacial lakes which have been genetically defined, whether they are epichelf lakes or they are landlocked lakes or they are proglacial lakes. This is a continental ice sheet. And this is the old paleo direction of the glaciers that have been deduced from the paleo markings or the glacial evidences. This is a map of the lakes you can see over here. We have been monitoring this Schumacher, in very great detail. There has been stakes put over here in the southern part of the Schumacher, also in the northern part of the shelf ice. And it has been deduced that the western part of this range, that is over here, it has been shrinking 24 meters in over 10 years. That means on an average, nearly 11 meters it took in 2002 and 3. And 4 minor advances you can see over here. Over here, 0.98, 0.25. But major deduction is that there is a recession and this ice margin is going back. Similarly is happening in this notch of the snout of the glacier, which is over here, you can see over here. And this is receding. And the rate of recession, you can see over here. In last 25 years, about 17.16 at the rate of per decade, it has receded back. Now, these are the location of the stakes. It's a huge area that they have covered. And this is the direction that the ice sheet is moving in two direction ways and at different rates, which is given over here. And an average rate is about 6.21 meters per year. And these are two work by different people, but you can see the relationship is very close. So there's not much of the difference between two different studies. And these ice sheet stakes have also been put in the deep areas of the Antarctic, way back, right up to the mountain chain over here, both at mountains. And with this, they have also deducted what is the loss of the ice sheet, which we are suffering at present. That means you can see over here, this is the ice shelf, Nevelin ice shelf, and this is the polar ice sheet. So different rates of migration of the movement of the ice sheet has been deducted. Discharge rates have been deducted, and this work is still under progress and it is going to be published. What is interesting is that they have done the GPR surveys, ground penetrating radar surveys, and they have reduced what is the basement topography. With this basement topography, they have calculated the ice mass which is lying above this area and how much ice mass is getting lost because of the global warming or climate change. And then they have deduced how much ice is we are losing ice mass in different areas. So the geomorphological part has been covered in the last 10 or 15 years, and some of these works has already been published. Maps have been prepared, and the paleo path of the glaciers have been reduced based upon these glacier erratics which have been formed over here, or the markings or these glacial lakes, which are now fossil lakes. This is a very interesting work, and which corroborates what was published by King in 2012 in Nature, defining that this particular area of Antarctic, where our areas of operation, Schumacher and other areas are located, this is the area where there's a more or less a positive mass. That means, as compared to these areas, we are in a comfortable positions. And this is corroborated by this study, which says that the glacial deglaciation was in different phases. And at present, we are in this stage over here. And you can see that 50,000 years, 100,000 years, and nearly 120 or 130,000 years, again, there were different phases of deglaciation. And this is the period when the advancements of the glaciers were there. So we have now a systematic climatological record for the last 160,000 years, which is going to be published, and it will be corroborating what Kings and others have done already in the Nature. Establishing, this is the question number 3 we have come. The question was establishing the Gondwana linkages. And as I have told you, this eastern mobile belt of India and the eastern Antarctic, they are very closely related with each other. And this evidences we have also getting in the Lasman Hills, where the 3rd Indian station, Lasman Bharti, has come up. And the studies over there indicate that there was an Indo-Austria Antarctic suture in the Princess Elizabeth Land. And this is a new discovery and a new record that we have published. And this has also provided a new time frame for this, linking the Pan-African orogeny. Pan-African orogeny is again a tectonic event, which is 500 million years old. So this particular event has also been recognized. And this is the last orogenic event in Antarctic. This is the Lambert Glacier. You can see the different rates of movement of this glacier. This is the fastest moving glacier. And currently, in the 42nd expedition, Indian scientists are going to these areas to really work out on these particular aspects also. We have a very well-established geophysical laboratory in Maitri Station, and all the instruments that practically are required, whether it is because of the earthquake or absolute gravimeter or GPS observation, everything is located there, and some of the world-class publications have come up. You can read these. The magnetic field observations suggest that the dipolar field of the Earth has declined over the decades. This is a very strong deduction. The absolute gravity reading is a reference point, where most of the people, those who are in Antarctic stations, they take these as a reference points. We have a broadband seismic station in Maitri, which records very minor earthquakes which take place because when the ice shelves breaks or the big icebergs, they get detached, then there are some small tremors. Then these seismometers, they record it. Coming to the 4th point, that is the microbial studies. We are very fortunate that the Indian scientists, they have identified 8 new genera and more than 100 new species from the polar regions. And out of this, 40 are from Antarctic. So mapping of the terrestrial flora, whether it is lichens, mosses, cyanobacteria, we have done it along the longitudinal gradients in Schumacher, and now this work is also being done in this Lasman Hills. The Center of Cellular Microbiology is doing excellent job, and they have already published a lot of literature on adaptation of life forms in Antarctic due to the specific cold genes. And there are also some, sampling that has been done for suggesting the pharmaceutical use of these microorganisms in industries. Space weather has been a forte of Indian Institute of Geomagnetism. Maitri has got an array of antennas to measure the cosmic radio noise using rheometer, and this is one of the rare stations in our this quadrangle of the central Downing Moorland, where this sort of experiment is being done. And this was done in collaboration with the Swedish, where we had a MARA, that was an inverted radar system to view the upper atmosphere. The last question was to interpret what is the human imprints and the national aspirations of the science in Antarctic wilderness. Now you can find here is the gray areas and the white areas. There are some areas where the human activity is there, and there are also some areas where there is no human activity. So you can see that most of the areas have been traversed by humans to reach to the South Pole or to establish new stations. Like China has got now 5 stations in Antarctic, basically to cover a ice core from the ice a dome. They have a station Zhongshan, they have a station over here, they have Lunun over here. Russia has got practically everywhere excepting this segment. They have a station in the Antarctic Peninsula, they have Midney over here, they have Vostok right over here. So the question is that what is the social impact or the social relationship of the people, those who are working in the different areas? And to avoid the conflicts, this was decided that each country must have their own legislation, so that in case of any problem, the local regulations or local rules of that country will be followed. And fortunately, India also has now is preparing a draft Antarctic bill, which is already there in the parliament. So I think with this, I come to a closure of my talk, and I have tried to, give you a brief idea about what Indians have been doing in the last about 20, 25 years to keep pace with the changing scientific domain in the entire the world, international world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ravindra, for your very fascinating presentation. And we are very proud of the fact that Indian scientists who have done such pioneering work in studying the Antarctica. And what is particularly fascinating is the what you have determined that climatic conditions or the ice conditions in the Antarctica also have an impact on our own weather patterns. And this, I think, also demonstrates how interconnected, densely interconnected the entire Earth is, in a sense. All living systems are, connected with one another. And that is something which perhaps sometimes we do forget. So I have now great pleasure in inviting Dr. Tamban Meloth, Scientist G, Group Director, Polar Sciences, National Center for Polar and Ocean Research, Goa. You have the floor, sir. And I would request you to please keep to the 15-minute time.
Yeah, good evening. I would think it's already late in the evening, so I would not take so much of time. So I would rather actually just try to give a few brief points, which are the new things, what's happening as far as Antarctica and responding to climate change. So rather than actually talking about science of it, I would rather point out on the larger issues which has come up recently that was probably not known in the past. So if you look at the Antarctica, most of us actually see it as a large white piece of marble sitting over of a size of nearly about 4.5 times of Indian subcontinent. And we normally believe it is just a static body sitting over there. But however, actually, over the time, with the multiple institutions as well, multiple agencies working on using multiple satellites, what we really know now that actually Antarctica is a highly dynamic body, which is what you see here, actually, the flow of the glaciers, the ice sheets flowing into the ocean, which shows that actually Antarctica is no longer a static body as you think about. Actually, it's a highly dynamic body responding to the changing climate as well as responding to and its changes are also bringing changes to the climate itself. And if you look at what are those major effects, I will only point out very few points because I think this particular audience would not like to get into the details of it. Actually, I would rather just point out very few points. One, first and foremost, actually, that Antarctica, actually, what we know actually is is responding to the changing climate. If you look at the Antarctic, the glacier change through time, we have seen since within about last even 10 to 20 years itself, the large amount of the ice is being lost, especially Western Antarctica. And why we should be worried about is essentially actually that the current knowledge actually which clearly state that actually the global sea level has only two major culprits which is rising to it. One is the thermal expansion of the seawater itself, And the second one is the water which is added to it actually, which is essentially because of the melting of the ice. And these two together, as you can see in the, so together these two may essentially constitute what actually contributing to the global sea level. And if you look at the Antarctica's contribution or the polar ice level, actually what we have seen, one thing very clearly seen since last 1 decade is that actually there has been a significant increase in the contribution of these ice sheets than in the past. That's a very recent past we are talking about. So the changes what we see in the globe today are directly find as a response in the polar ice sheets, which was not something actually which is known in the past, especially because actually quite a long time people used to think Antarctic ice sheet is going to remain as it is, but it's not a fact. That's what most of us, the latest IPCC result very clearly shows that actually that it's been much faster than actually what even been predicted. And that change essentially comes from the West Antarctica. The West Antarctica has become a hotspot compared to rest of even other part of the Antarctica. Because the main reason why West Antarctica is responding is much faster way. The West Antarctica, what we call here actually is has a large area of ice which is just floating over the ocean, as well as areas which is much more warmer. So what is happening to the West Antarctica is actually because of this floating ice, what we call actually ice shelf, have not only the global warming, the warming is happening from the surface actually, but also the warming which is the ocean water is getting warmer, which is eroding a large part of this ice shelves, leading to the disintegration of this ice, the ice shelf itself. More importantly, which is very recent thing actually, what the new knowledge actually, the large warm air incursions, which I will be talking about in the latest to what's happening to Antarctica. This warm air incursions which is coming, what we call actually is the atmospheric rivers, which is something which was completely unknown in the past, is something is happening to Antarctica, bringing heat waves and rains to Antarctica. So this is something is going to be dramatically change how Antarctica would behave in coming decades. For example, the rise, what you have been almost hearing every time about the media is actually that loss of large ice shelves being lost to the Antarctica, like what you call trillion-ton ice is being lost, and all this is what we typically hear it. What we don't know actually, why do they be losing actually? They are not just losing because actually not only just warming, but also there are many other processes which happen actually, which controls or the limits the flow of this ice. That things are also being changed, and together with the warm ocean as well as the warmer atmosphere is making these ice being lost, forever, some of them. And this could also have an impact as we go in future. They can be dramatically faster than actually that what whenever we see sometimes some changes are slow and some changes can be really dramatic, because actually the warmer ice on the bottom, especially along the bedrock, actually can be leading to faster flow of this. Once the flow starts, it's impossible to stop it. That's how these kind of larger bodies behaves. And this I'm not going to deal actually, because how do these changes happening, the climate change also bringing to the life in Antarctica. I think some of you must have heard actually that the population, certain population like penguins are getting affected. And this effect actually are much more, the one latest prediction which says actually is a model-based study, actually latest study, which clearly shows that by 2100 actually, maybe the current temperature at which we are actually, the speeding up, we could be the entire penguin population could be lost. Even if you're going with the current, nobody believes actually this is going to be actual case. At least this would be the minimum temperature at which we would be rising. Even then, actually, the nearly 90 to 80% of the Antarctic penguin population could be, extinct, or maybe only certain species could be. Sorry, at least emperor penguins would be extinct. That's how the prediction happens now. Now, just keeping that aside, actually, I just want one important point, actually, which actually normally we never think about, actually. Just this year, for example, there was an unprecedented heat wave in Antarctica, which came in a lot of newspapers and so on, wherein the East Antarctica, which is considered to be the coldest part of the Antarctica, has become nearly 40 degrees Celsius warmer than its current, its normal temperature at that time. For example, the month of March, it's considered to be about -60 to -50 degree in this part of Antarctica. It reached as warm as, yeah, there was within few days, the temperature reached to about -10 degree to -11 degree, which is really, so fast and so, heated up actually. This is happening is also in Antarctica. We must be every time hearing heat waves, breaching its record every year in the rest of the world. But nobody really believed in Antarctica could be that level actually. But that's happening especially in the last few years, because what we happening actually, that there's something called atmospheric rivers. Nobody normally used to talk about atmospheric rivers in the past. These are nothing but actually those, very long streams of air, warm and intense moist rich air traveling all the way from tropics to subtropics to, polar regions. This was something very, very few in the past several decades, but it's happening very, very common recently. And these rivers actually brings a large amount of warm air, and also have a high amount of moisture in them, because warmer air will also have more moisture in them. And that brings not only a higher temperature, but also rains, means more moist, more warmer moist. This one leading to, rains happening often in Antarctica now, which was completely unknown. So such kind of stories you will keep listening every year after year, because as we see the extreme weather happening in this country, it's not only in this country, it's all over the world, and the polar regions are not out of it. And more importantly, that has to a climate change impact. Due to the ozone depletion, greenhouse gas emissions increase, and sea surface temperature increase. These are three main culprits which considered to be the why more atmospheric rivers are reaching Antarctica. And such a large shift can also bring more and more atmospheric rivers to Antarctica. That could have strong implications, because intense atmospheric rivers can also weaken the ice, because rain, as they occur, they will occur more energy release, more warmer air, actually more warmer temperature, also decreasing the surface reflectivity, leading to the breakage of many of these ice shelves. For example, one study clearly shows that nearly about 60% of the ice calving during the last 20 years have been directly triggered by atmospheric rivers. And as we see that under the future warming conditions, atmospheric rivers are going to be more and more reaching Antarctica. So we are going to face a situation where actually this is going to be a very common phenomenon, which was not a common phenomenon at all in the, so I would say that actually when Antarctic Treaty was constituted, actually it was more of geopolitical. But when the real thing happening now for the last 20 years, the real climatic change impacting Antarctica, and unfortunately geopolitics has really slightly shifted from Antarctica now to the north, more of the Arctic. That's a very sad part of it actually, because this is a time really Antarctica should be really looked into it. That's what I think I just want to say here. And I would not take more time. I just wanted to say that it's more vital to understand Antarctic climate now than ever in the past, and also maybe not in future. So therefore, we also have these projects, actually larger projects, which we are joining together hands, actually trying to understand this climate in a better way. That's what we are trying to do. I stop here. Thank you very much. Just wanted to say actually in one point that what's happening in Antarctica does not stay in Antarctica. It's reaching all over the world, and it's going to, as Dr. Rasikravindra has pointed, it also impacts our Indian monsoons, and it also impacts the rest of the world. So therefore, it's a high time that actually I think, keeping aside actually all those, Cold War issues, which brought people to Antarctica, this is the real time, Antarctica, real time we should be looking into study more into Antarctica and rest of the world. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that extremely interesting presentation. And also, I think you are only reinforcing the message that has already been given by Dr. Ravindra, that the health of the Antarctica is related to the health of the entire planet. And for us to think that what happens on the two ends of the earth do not really affect the rest of the planet, that is a completely wrong assumption to make. I would only like to add that in addition to the various influences that you mentioned, At the time that I went to the Antarctica sometime in 2009 or 2010, one of the disturbing things that came out was that for the first time on the ice, they also found microplastics and various other kinds of pollutants, which for the first time, it was only in the surface area that they found this. When they went deeper, of course, you did not. So there's also that a lot of the pollution that is taking place in the rest of the world is also finding its way to the Antarctica. And that was also the case later on when I went to the Arctic Ocean on another research trip. And that was also the case there, that there was a tremendous amount of pollutants, which were coming and impacting this area. The other point that I also wanted to emphasize was that we are talking about a 1% increase in temperature, global average temperature, or 1.5 degrees global average temperature. We do not realize that this is an average, that actually there are parts of the world where the temperature increase, as we just saw, can be much higher than what the average is. In the Arctic, I believe, for the last several years, temperature has been increasing at the rate, has been rising up to 3.5 degrees centigrade. So that's a very disturbing development. I have now a great pleasure in inviting Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay. She is Editor-in-Chief of Geography and You, as I said, and she will be talking about the future of Antarctica in a changing world. You have the floor, ma'am.
Yeah, so thank you, Chair, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Shailesh Naik, for having me here. So I'm going to take this discourse a little away from science. We have been seeing a lot of science here, and
Can you speak a little closer to the mic?
Yeah,
please?
Can you hear me? Yeah, so Dr. Thamban actually highlighted, the humongousness or the hugeness of what is happening right now with the temperatures. But I wanted to just say that we need to address the cause. We need to address that we are not really doing anything about the emission. We have business as usual even today. So it is geopolitics. It is, at the end of the day, you need policy. You need people to actually sit down and say, okay, this is not what we want to do, because this is the impact. This is what's going to happen. And this is going to affect us more than anything, because the kind of, if that kind of temperature rise happens, then there is melting. And if there's melting, there's a 60-meter rise. If the entire Antarctic melts, of course, that's never going to happen, because certain parts of Antarctic, like Dr. Thamban highlighted, there is more buildup, but certain parts are definitely melting. But if that happens, we'll at least have a 2-meter rise by the end of this, maybe by 2050 or by 2060, or maybe, these are the predictions. There are various predictions, various models. But basically what I'm trying to say is that this means that countries like India, countries like cities like Kolkata, or cities, all the coastal cities, Chennai, they will all be inundated. So we wouldn't have those cities. So it is important for us. It's, Antarctic's going to affect us. Maybe like it. We talk about climate, we can talk about a lot of things, but it's going to impact us in just a few years. These young people in your lifetime, you might see drastic changes, because these changes are very drastic. So that is why we need to know about Antarctic, because it's important for us to know about Antarctic. We are a tropical country. We are a resource poor country. We need to know. And this scientific body is allowing us to know that, get that information. From that, we need to lead it to policy. So I'll just move on. So change is inevitable. We know that, that's kind of basic, isn't it? Everything changes. So climate is changing, but very, very difficult now, because it's too much. And it's too much change is difficult to handle. So right now, climate is changing too fast, and too much. So I have some and figures there, which we'll see later perhaps. The other part is that geopolitics is also changing. So we are changing in both ways. We are changing in climate and we are changing in geopolitics. When we talk about a changing world, that means that we are having issues that are shifting from something that was before to something that is now, which is not, which needs to be understood in different contexts. So basically the social, the cultural, and the influence of the Western world in, telling us what to do. If you realize there are a lot of issues that we follow. For example, I don't know if the scientific people would support me here, but ozone is one of these issues which we need to look at a little differently. For example, we all have changed our entire technology when the Montreal Protocol came. They said that, we need to change CFCs. We have to get in different, because of course the chlorofluorocarbons are affecting the ozone and all of that. But tropical countries, the ozone layer is anyway very thin. It is not, we are not the people who are really affected by the ozone depletion. It is the temperate countries who are primarily affected. Australia was being affected. Of course, the ozone hole has not repaired in totality. Maybe another decade over the Antarctic, it will repair another decade. But it is on the way to, it's definitely a positive thing. But the fact is that, is the agenda, India specific or tropical countries? So we have to review that in another context. We have to think beyond, beyond science and think about how perhaps geopolitics, because science for Antarctic is a political asset. It is used for politics. It is a way to dominate certain places under the construct of science. We need to know, but we also need to know in an egalitarian and, in a, I'm sorry. Okay. So I have a graph here, which perhaps we can see when it comes on about despite the fact that, we have this Antarctic Treaty system, which was put into place, and it talks about, how countries cannot have any territorial rights. Nobody has any territorial rights over here, so you can't claim any territory. It is for everyone. But at the same time, this exceptional kind of mechanism does not deter countries from joining. So more and more countries have been joining. The last one has been, the last few ones have been Belarus in 2016, Estonia in 2006, Estonia in 2001. So, the fact that nobody can claim anything does not deter countries from joining the treaty. Now, why is that? Why is, you don't get anything. What do you really get? Apart from the fact that you can go and do science, what is it that you're gaining out of being in a mechanism that doesn't really reward you? You don't have asset. So why is it that nations are continuously in the race of being part of the Antarctic Treaty system? So for that, we need to look back into history a little bit of interesting, sites, maybe I can say some imperial history. So what actually happened was way back when the explorations happened in the Antarctic, and if you know about the Scot, the Ambots, and all of the Norwegian and the British people who went and explored the continent, it was in the early 1900s, 1911, 1913. These are the time frames. So at that point of time, Britain was expanding its territories. They were acquiring more and more territory. And so they thought, oh, now Antarctic, this is a new place, let's go and get it. And Falkland Islands is, if you recall, there was a lot of, there still is, kind of tensions around Falkland Island. So across the Falkland Islands, like so you Argentina and Chile, and then it curves and it goes into the Antarctic Peninsula. So that is the section of the land where the British station, quote unquote, was being established, to which Argentina opposed. And there was a Hope Bay incident that was in 1952, where this was the only instance where we have seen guns being fired and a kind of it was not really a war, but yes, there was an altercation. After which the Royal Navy came in, and helped the scientists to establish the station back again. This is the only instance, but here we see that this portion of Argentina, of Antarctic, actually has claims of Argentina, it claims of Chile, as well as it has claims of Britain. No, not happening. Do I get extra time? Okay, so basically what I want to bring to light here is that after this, the new imperialism came in, where US and USSR also set its foot into the Antarctic and kind of built stations. And what it did to the continent really was that, yeah, so we can skip. This is where we can see the number of agreements that have really gone from 1959 to 2018. Then we have, this is the claims, if you can see that little pies that these people have cut off and it's overlapping. So Argentina and Chile and Britain, they want little pieces of pie. This was earlier on in 1952. And later on, a lot more little pies have been cut out, but none of this is really recognized. Yet, what is interesting is that when US and Britain and Russia walked into this space, they started putting out flags and stamps and post offices. And even in the websites today, you will see something called British Antarctic Territory. And they claim that it's their territory, yet it does not have rights over them. So now this mechanism of ATS, where you actually have certain presence of your nationalist character, at the same time, you do not have any rights to control, is called bifocalism. So this mechanism of bifocalism actually gives Antarctic its uniqueness. And this is what I argue is also the need of the hour for India. And this is what we propagate for the future. We need to take this forward, because right now what we do is we're doing science. We really are not, we do have a post office, if I'm not incorrect. In Metri, we have a post office, yeah. And but other mechanisms of asserting one's, through science, asserting one's presence, we need to build that up in a better way. Now, I will skip all of this, I'm sorry, but I have a little bit about how these administrative divisions are done. So there's ASPA, there is ASMA, and there is HSM. So these historic sites are, so there are, except for ASMA, which are the 7 regions, which are managed regions by different countries, the other regions need permit. They have stations. So that is the ASPA. There are 72 ASPAs. That means basically we have 76 stations of different countries, and we have 72 ASPAs. So basically whatever station areas are there, or maybe a little beyond, for certain countries manage that, and you need permits to enter that space. So this is again part of bifocalism. Here I want to bring a example of China.
After this, because we are completely running out
Yeah,
of time.
I just have a couple. I'll go to the last. This here, Dome A, I want to mention for China. They want to, the Kunlun station they have over there is newly established, and they want to have a ASMA over there. Because this is an area which has got a lot of buildup of ice, and it is used for, it can be used potentially for military surveillance, which is why Australia is objecting to this. So this is an interesting example of how different countries are using for different purposes, yet we need to, objectively look at this a little beyond science. And I'll just bring this to historicity for India. Dr. Rasik Ravindra has very, well, nicely pointed out about the kind of work we've done. But I want to take it beyond the 1950s when India actually went to the UN. I want to, take it back because Chile, if you know, there's, people say that Antarctic has no indigenous community, but that is incorrect. Antarctic has, in the peninsular region, indigenous community, which no one talks about. And these are claims that are not, addressed. Chile children who were born in that part of Antarctic. These people have fishing communities and sometimes even military communities who were there, and they are indigenous communities. So these have to be addressed. These claims have to be addressed. They have to be looked into. And maybe we can even draw a history back a little further back when we have Scott in 1911, 1913, two of his crew member. So that's, they claim, British claims that it's their expedition, but here we have two members who are from India actually, not Indians, but from India. So one is Lieutenant Bowles. He's from Royal Indian Marine, and we have George Clark Simpson. He's from Shimla. He was in the Met Office. So we have an Indian link there as well. So therefore, I conclude that a creation of more identity for India, which will help us do this bifocalism, and at the same time, creation of a middle block maybe with Russia and China for research, which we are not looking at right now. We are working with Norway, we are working with Britain, but we are not working with Russia and China and Antarctic. Probably that is another step that we need to take. And I conclude here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think you have very, very well, sketched out, some of the geopolitical challenges which are there in terms of, conservation in the Antarctica. And I presume that, this is an issue which is going to perhaps become even more important as we go forward. I have now great pleasure in inviting Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi of the South Asia University to make a presentation. Particularly interesting because he has been a lead author, at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the 6th assessment report, which actually is quite an alarming report about what the situation with respect to climate change and the wider ecological issue is. So he would be able to give us really a very, very good account of really what is the kind of challenge that we are facing with the kind of changes that are taking place in the Antarctica. And he's also been looking at the geopolitical aspect as well. He's the chairman of the Indian Ocean Research Group, and he's an observer in the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So this background, and particularly what he has been, the work that he has been doing at the IPCC, I think will be of particular interest to us. Professor Chaturvedi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Respected Ambassador Shyam Saranji, you have always been a source of great inspiration. And I feel so honored and privileged to be on panel today. And my due apologies, I could not be present with all of you in person. Dr. Shirendra Nayakji, I remember when he was the Secretary, Ministry of Earth Sciences, Social Sciences and Humanities in India got a huge support. Dr. Rasik Ravendraji, I remember his outstanding contributions when he was the director of the National Center for Antarctic and Ocean Research, now Polar Research. Dr. Thamban, Dr. Sinhaji, Ms. Sulagna, thank you very, very much indeed. I want to talk about Antarctic geopolitics and Anthropocene. I will be talking about this intersection between the classical geopolitical assertions and the fact that we do need a new Anthropocene geopolitics. So, Mr. Chairman, this presentation is dedicated to the preamble to the Antarctic Treaty, which says that Antarctica shall forever be used for peaceful and scientific purposes, and it will never become a site of international discord. And it is also dedicated to India's Antarctic program. And the earlier presentations graphically show the outstanding achievements that the Indian scientific community has made to this exceptional laboratory of the Anthropocene. Now, please also allow me to have this disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are entirely mine, and they do not necessarily represent official policy or position of the Ministry of Earth Sciences or NCPOR, Government of India. Now, who owns Antarctica? This is at the heart of Antarctic geopolitics. Then, it is now, and I think it is going to stay with us for quite some time. And another question is, can Antarctica be decolonized? So my entire presentation, while talking about the imperative of a new Anthropocene geopolitics, would be addressing these two very interesting, very important baskets of issues. Now, it has already been pointed out that when we talk about who owns Antarctica, we are looking at a very complex geopolitical map, starting from 1908, British Antarctic Territory, Falklands, Malvinas, and then later on extended to the Antarctic Peninsula, right up to 1942. So you have a very, very complex map with 3 overlapping claims on Antarctic Peninsula, and we can see that there is still a part of Antarctica which is unclaimed. Now, Antarctica Treaty, signed in 1959 in Washington, and then it came into effect in 1961, said, as I said earlier, that it is recognizing that it is in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene or object of this international discord. Now, when we talk about Antarctica Treaty and we talk about the 12 original signatories, 7 claimant states plus US, then USSR, Belgium, Japan, and South Africa, we often talk about the Cold War context in which the Antarctic Treaty was being negotiated. It's a very interesting story. I don't have time to go into it, but let me also have another strategic recall, which is that in 1950s, India did make a very important intervention in the United Nations. The then ambassador, a permanent representative of India to the United Nations, Ambassador Arthur S. Lal, proposed a resolution on the question of Antarctica, which was then explained by Prime Minister Nehru in May 1958 in the Indian Parliament. And he said, I quote, "We are not challenging anybody's rights there, but it has become important more specifically because of the possible experimentation of atomic weapons and the like, that the matter should be considered by the United Nations. The fact that Antarctica contains many very important minerals, especially atomic energy minerals, is one of the reasons why this area is attractive to various countries. We thought it would be desirable to have a discussion about this in the United Nations." So it's a long story based on archival research. I will not go into that, Mr. Chairman, but the point that I want to make with all emphasis at my command is that India's post-colonial engagement, India's appeal to keep Antarctica peaceful in the best interest of humankind is a long-standing promise and engagement. The Antarctic Treaty, now of 1959, has, as we all know, all these very important provisions: peaceful purposes, open to all for scientific investigation, nuclear activity is banned, geographical coverage south of 60 degrees south, consultative meetings, and so on. But I would specifically make a reference to Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty, which, as I said, is where we have a very complex intersection between Antarctic geopolitics and Antarctic law. It says, "Nothing contained in the present treaty shall be interpreted as a renunciation by any contracting party of previously asserted rights or claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica. A renunciation or diminution by any contracting party of any basis of claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica, which it may have, whether as a result of its activities or those of its nationals in Antarctica or otherwise, prejudicing the position of any contracting party as regards its recognition or non-recognition of any of the state's rights of or claim or basis of claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica." And then it says, "No acts or activities taking place while the present treaty is in force shall constitute a basis for asserting, supporting, or denying a claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica or create any rights of sovereignty in Antarctica. No new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica shall be asserted while the present treaty is in force." So on the one hand, the preamble to the Antarctic Treaty; on the other hand, Article 4, where the imperial colonial past is legally frozen. So these Antarctic Treaty, the territorial claims to Antarctica, it is important to note, are legally frozen but geopolitically speaking, very, very active. Now, of course, this contested territoriality of Antarctica poses some very complex legal questions. And I have a quote from Professor Donald Rothwell, a very well-known authority on international law in the polar regions. And he says that how difficult it has been when it comes to the law enforcement in Antarctica. And that is the reason that it is the nationality rather than territoriality that has become the legal fulcrum around which the geopolitical equilibrium of the Antarctic is to be maintained. Now, how do you establish a claim in Antarctica in the polar environment? And I think this is where we see science becoming a currency of geopolitical influence. Going back to 1956-57 International Geophysical Year, we missed it narrowly. 12 countries, which then became the members of the Antarctic Treaty, had participated in the International Geophysical Year. There is also this intriguing question of establishing effective occupation in the polar, demanding polar environment. No surprise, Antarctic science has been, is, and will remain a very important currency of geopolitical influence in the Antarctic. Now, the complexity of the claims and counterclaims does not stop here. Please note, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, France, and UK mutually recognize each other's claims. Chile and Argentina recognize each other's claims, but not the other 5 claims. As has already been mentioned, there are overlapping claims on Antarctic Peninsula. And then there are semi-claimants, United States and Russia. Their position is they do not recognize these territorial claims, but they do reserve all rights, including the right to make a future Antarctic claim if necessary. Now, fast forward, today, if we look at the Antarctic geopolitical system, Antarctic system of governance, we have new actors, interests, and as pointed out earlier in the earlier presentations, rising geopolitical tensions in the Antarctic governance. At the core of the question, of course, are the questions of authority, legitimacy, and effectiveness of the Antarctic Treaty system. Now, we have seen in recent pasts the assertions of these geopolitical claims. If we take a look at Australia's Antarctic territory and 2017 foreign policy white paper, it clearly says Antarctica is important to Australia. We have sovereignty over 42% of the continent, including sovereign rights over adjacent offshore areas. The government, it says, is spending additional $2.2 billion to protect Australia's significant Antarctic interests. So this is the Australia's continental shelf confirmed by the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. And as I've argued elsewhere, when these extended claims were being made, India made it a point to record, to put it on record in the United Nations Concerned Committee, saying that India does not recognize these territorial claims on Antarctica. Antarctica has gone through some very important discursive transformations. Land of science, 1950s to right about 1970s. In decade of 1980s saw a very hectic resource geopolitics, starting with Camilla, in the wake of the Law of the Sea Convention, Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, followed by 1988 Canberra, Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities, a serious crisis in the Antarctic Treaty system, with countries being divided into pro-mining and anti-mining lobby. Eventually, the crisis being resolved in the 1991 Environmental Protocol on Environmental Protection, also called the Madrid Protocol. And Antarctica in 2048, I'll come to this point later. The point to be noted, Mr. Chairman, is that today we are looking at very entangled landscape in Antarctica. All these representations are entangled. Now, if we look at the diversity that we have in the Antarctic Treaty system today, right from 1961 to 70, where we have the 12 Antarctic Treaty consultative parties, please note the way in which the map changed, the table of membership changed during 1981 to 19. This was the decade of resource geopolitics. This was the decade when India decided to send its first expedition to Antarctica. under the leadership of Dr. Zahur Qasim. This was the moment of the India's return to Antarctica and post-colonial engagement with Antarctica. And the promise was that Antarctica, as Dr. Rasik Ravindraji has also pointed out earlier, will work for the democratization of Antarctic governance as an insider rather than challenge it from outside. So that is another very interesting point to note. If we look at the Antarctic Treaty system today, look at the incredible complexity that we have. All these measures, Seals Convention, 1959 Antarctic Treaty right at the middle, ATCM, various measures, resolutions, and decisions, 1991 Madrid Protocol, and so on. And if you look at the main actors, you have the ATCPs, you have Antarctic Treaty Secretariat, you have Committee on Environmental Protection, you have the Camelot Commission, which is in Hobart in Tasmania, you have COMMONAP, Council of Managers of Antarctic Program, you have the presence of a business of commercial industry, which is IATO, commercial tour operators, and you have Association of Southern Ocean Coalition, which articulates the environmental conservation related concerns. So Madrid Protocol, I will not go into it, but it is really heartening. It is extremely important that India is now just about to see its Antarctic bill. C. Raja Mohanty's vision statement I found extremely inspiring. And it is very important to note that in the light of what we have seen so far, that the Antarctic bill of India is a further commitment of India to the preamble and to the spirit of the Antarctic Treaty. I will not go into the details. Now, if we look at the challenges that Antarctica is facing, tourism, which is not simply a matter of regulating tourism, but it is also the matter of addressing some of the most geopolitically complex issues on Antarctica. India has made some very important interventions. In Sofia ATCM, we presented a widely important information paper. And just next week in Berlin, India will again be presenting a comprehensive information paper on building back and forth better for Antarctic tourism and enduring concerns in the pursuit of a strategic vision. So India remains committed to the fact that Antarctica shall be used and should be used forever for peaceful and scientific purposes. And we should be very careful when we interpret the term peaceful uses. Now, coming to the final part of my presentation, let me also briefly talk about the resilient nationalisms that we see in Antarctica. And I've already said that although legally frozen in the Antarctic Treaty, these Antarctic claims and nationalisms are very much active. Formally declared claims to territorial sovereignty, I have talked about that. A relative proximity of Antarctica to metropolitan territories in the case of Argentina and Chile. We have formations of social and cultural associations. You can see Antarctic maps, the cartography, the Argentinian maps on the sandwich bags in Ushuaia. You have regional and global hegemonic inclinations. You have alleged need in relation to resources. We have contested uses or practices in Antarctica, national pride and mobilization through national Antarctic programs, infrastructures and logistic arrangements, the politics of naming the Antarctic, and so on. So we do have assertions of all kinds of nationalisms in today's Antarctic. So these are just some of these visuals that you see right on the screen here. For example, the naming of the Queen Elizabeth Land when it comes to the British Antarctic claim. It has also been pointed out that the rise of China factor in the polar governance is also causing widespread concern. And as Anne-Marie Brady has talked about China as a polar great power, she does talk about the implications of China's quest for energy security in the Antarctic and for Antarctic governance. Managing fisheries resources sustainably remains another challenge, and India did engage with krill fishing in the earlier stages. And as we talk about the future, climate change, Anthropocene, and the kind of crisis that I think Dr. Thamban's presentation was absolutely outstanding in this respect, it's not a matter of whether, but it's a question of when we would address the challenges in the context of resource geopolitics, which includes IUU fishing in the Southern Ocean. So science remains the currency of geopolitical influence. If we just take a look at the COMNAP's compilation of Antarctic research stations, here you have 5 stations built by China, Maitri and Bharati are also being shown here. I could not collect the entire collage because the number of scientific stations is very large, but certainly science remains the currency of geopolitical influence, the principle of effective occupation under international law, and the fact that those who demonstrate substantial scientific interest in Antarctica, which has also been interpreted as setting up of a scientific base on Antarctica, adds another layer of complexity. So changing the nature and role of Antarctic science, I think Rasik Ravindraji has already made a reference to it. Biological prospecting is again a very complex issue area where I can imagine interventions, very important interventions made by India in the times to come when it comes to the question of equitable access and equity and so on. But this is one basket of issues which is going to be very, very important and contested. Now, coming to Antarctica, my final concluding point, Mr. Chairman, how do we ensure that it remains a continent of hope, peace, and science? How do we ensure that Antarctica, despite these assertions of classical geopolitical instincts of territoriality, remains a global knowledge commons in and for the Anthropocene? For whom does the Antarctic speak? And who speaks for Antarctica is also a very important question. In a recent publication, The Future of Antarctica, Scenario from Classical Geopolitics by Geoffrey McKee, David Atkinson, and Marcus Howard, there is a very interesting reference to the geopolitics of fear. And let me quote, "Fears are expressed that the Antarctic Treaty system may be unable to respond adequately to these challenges, or that major changes will be forced upon it. In particular, there is ongoing speculation about the future intent of China in the context of its expanding number of Antarctic research bases to 5 and its interest in commercial krill fisheries. China has also been identified as a potential future architect of a significant challenge to the ATS when the Madrid Protocol comes up for possible review from 2048, not that far. 2048 is to be marked because that is the time when the ban on mining under the Madrid Protocol can be taken up for a review." And the book further says, I quote, "The ongoing success of the Antarctic Treaty system cannot, however, be taken for granted, particularly in an age of renewed great power competition. This new context will likely require careful management with skilled leadership and commitment to consensus, as was needed first in the 1950s and then in the 90s, 80s, and 90s, when the system was last under significant tension. It has led some scholars to even argue that Antarctic Treaty system is hollowing out. The agenda is becoming crowded. The duration of Antarctic Treaty meetings has been reduced. So the future is full of challenges.
I think we'll have to,
yes,
Professor, we'll have to conclude because we are completely out of time.
Yeah. My last statement. Yeah. Towards New Delhi Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting in 2026, I think India's scientific achievements have already been highlighted. In 2007, we had the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting here in Delhi. And now 2026, again, we would be meeting. National Center in Goa would also be hosting SCAR 2022. And the fact of the matter is that India's Antarctic program, India's commitment to Antarctic science will continue to give us rewarding outcomes. It will continue to strengthen the preamble to the Antarctic Treaty. But let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by quoting Gurudev from Gitanjali, because at the end of the day, I think the challenge that we all face in the Anthropocene, particularly in the light of the IPCC reports that you made a reference to it, how do we keep Antarctica a continent of hope, peace, and cooperation, where the mind is without fear and the health is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason hath not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country, humanity awake. So it is with this note of hope and optimism, Mr. Chairman, that I conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much. We certainly need that message of hope. So far, I think whatever we have heard is somewhat depressing. But as you said, we have to in fact remain hopeful. And as far as the geopolitical side is concerned, you are right that science remains the currency of geopolitical influence. So I think the work which is being done by our very eminent scientists is of very great importance. Now the last word.
Yes.
So Professor Anindya Sinha, who's a professor and head of academics, National Institute of Advanced Studies, of which Shailesh Naik ji is the director. He has been essentially looking at over the last 3 decades on the issues of behavioral ecology, cognitive ethology, population, behavioral genetics, evolutionary biology, conservation studies. All these are very esoteric terms for us, but I think what we are really going to be educated about is really the relationship between ecology, particularly the very fragile ecology of the Antarctica, and the non-human population of this fascinating continent. Because although it is just ice, but that ice also has a large number of living beings, both under the ice and over the ice. So that particular fascinating story is what Dr. Sinha will be telling us about. You have the floor, sir.
Sure. I won't take too much time. I just I wanted to thank the IIC for inviting me. And I hope, last but not the least, this is a voice of the non-humans. Unlike the humans who should have known better, and as we see, don't seem to know better, the non-humans are perhaps being lost in this battle. So I just wanted to very quickly talk to you about how complex non-human lives can be as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So here is a slide which just tells you, and if you look at yourselves, you will realize why we are complex beings, right? So at the level of the individual, we can communicate with each other. We have personalities. We are all very different, unique individuals, but we can set up complex social relationships. And then you have the society. And in this society, you have a whole range of individuals of different age, sex, dominance, hierarchies, kinship, and they form clusters, cliques, groups, alliances, and then there is politics that goes across these groups. So if you look at it that way, evolutionarily, each individual, and this could be a penguin, it could be a human, has a very complex network of associations within which we live, and we have alternative survival strategies. We are also very long-lived beings, and so when we live long, we live in a society which keeps changing, and therefore we also have a lot of strategies which we can use over our lifetimes, right? And here is a bit of a complex slide, so don't bother too much about it. But it's just how complex the lives of the penguins themselves can be as well. And I just want to exemplify. So first, of course, you have behavioral interactions between females and male individual penguins during courtship and pair bonding. And in fact, for some species, like the Gentoo penguin, which I'll talk about later, they mate for life. Secondly, you have behavioral interactions between the same sexes, but at other times. You could have them, of course, when they're incubating eggs, guarding chicks, foraging, and they have extremely complex lives where the father and the mother take turns in incubating eggs, they take turns in guarding their chicks while the other goes and feeds, right? And you also have these interactions which could be affiliative, it could be dominance related, it could be agonistic, it could be sexual, neutral, between non-pair bonded males and females. Penguins have extremely complex social relationships that go beyond their reproductive urge, right? And especially during the austral summer breeding season, there are very complex interactions. Now, what are the factors that determine these short-term behavioral interactions as well as the long-term social relationships? You have intrinsic biological factors, including age, sex, social hierarchy, inter-individual familiarity, intra-colony genetic relatedness. And also you have extrinsic ecological factors, including, of course, the sea ice characteristics, climatic variables, food resource availability, distribution. And let me assure you that relationships can change when there's a shortage of food, right? Because competition is everywhere, even amongst pair-bonded penguins, right? So the other interesting aspect, which we sometimes forget, because we just say a penguin, but a penguin is not just a penguin. It depends on what species it is. And I just wanted to highlight two particular species, which are the two most common penguins that you see, especially around the Indian stations as well, which is the Adelie and the Gentoo. And they're remarkably different. So for example, the Adelie penguin has distinct life cycle phases, which are, again, as I said, influenced by intrinsic biological factors and environmental conditions. Males typically arrive from overwintering to the breeding grounds in October. There's elaborate courtship, mating with some degree of mate fidelity, not to a very great extent, unlike the Gentoo. 2 eggs are laid at different intervals, and so there's a sequential incubation of about 30 to 34 days, with first the males incubating, and while the females forage, and then the females come back, and then the males go foraging. So there is a guard phase of about 22 days, with the parents alternately guarding the hatch chicks, and finally the chicks themselves form creche, where the parents simultaneously both go off to forage, and they come back every 1 or 2 days until the chicks fledge at about 2 months of age, right? Now, what is remarkable, and I'm not going to talk about, is there are individual signatures. In these large communities, parents recognize their offspring, mates recognize their mates, all of this perhaps through vocal signatures. And there has been very little work on how these signatures are actually generated. Right. If you go to the Gentoo penguin, on the other hand, they again have a very distinct breeding season, and the sexes gather in small colonies, and they usually mate with the same partner over and over again. The parents work together. They build very interesting circular nests of pebbles, foliage, sticks, and there's very fierce competition with severe fights for not only safe places, but also for the larger stones, which they require for their nests. Unlike the Adelie penguins, Gentoo penguins only have 2 eggs laid, and parents simultaneously guard them, which is for 28 days, and then parents alternately guard at a later stage the thermally independent chicks, again from creche, and then the parents simultaneously forage and feed, very similar to the Adelie, and then they remain. The juvenile Gentoo, unlike the Adelie, stay close to their breeding grounds. They don't go away further. And I will just briefly mention this. Now, to come to climate change, which is what I wanted to bring into the second part, they have complex lives. But what seems to sweep across these lives is climate change, right? There are a whole list of other problems that penguins face, all of them, not surprisingly, anthropogenic. It's us who cause these problems, as you saw even in the earlier talks. And this is a complex slide, but I'm not going too much into it. Basically, the light blue arrows show the direct effects of climate change. The light red arrows show indirect effects. When you have green arrows, large arrows pointing upwards, those are the species that are going up in spite of climate change. And when you have red arrows pointing downwards, those are the species populations that are slowly dying out. Now, one important point that I want to make here is that although climate change affects a whole range of species, in the Antarctica, given the extreme climatic conditions, extreme specificity of life requirements, climate change is likely to have much more profound effects than everywhere. And what seems to be happening amongst the penguins is that as a result of the change that has taken place so far, you clearly see 2 groups of penguin species. One, who we call the winners, who are generalists, who are able to adapt to a much larger range of situations. And you have the losers, who are the specialists. They are the ones who have actually evolved over millions of years to have very specific ecological niches, and they are the ones who are going to go out first. But what is also important to recognize is that there is a past. all these populations have had a past. There have been natural climate change when they have been shaped. And today, the behavioral ecologies that you see, the life history strategies that you see is what was shaped by past climate change. However, what is undoubtable is that the anthropogenic climate change that we are seeing in the Anthropocene far outstrips them. And it's important, therefore, to understand what is actually happening to them. Now, the reason, as I said, penguins are really affected by climate change is because they can't disperse very far, unlike flying birds. And even within the penguin species, those who can migrate a little more seem to do better under certain conditions, unless they are migrating to very, very specific situations, right? And in that case, climate change can bring about major difficulties. For example, we've already spoken about the Gentoo penguin and the Adelie penguin. It's really interesting that despite the fact that they're evolutionarily related, they're sympatric, that is, they occur in the same region. The Adelie penguin, as I mentioned, is ice obligate. It requires ice. It's pelagic. It spends a large part of its life in the open oceans, very far from their colonies. The adults of this species are known to travel even as much as 2,200 kilometers within one season away from their colonies during the non-breeding periods. The Gentoo penguin, on the other hand, is a stay-at-home penguin, right? It's very dependent. It's less dependent on the sea ice, has a very coastal lifestyle, rarely goes into the open oceans, and typically forages inshore on locally available prey, but it has a much wider prey base than does the Adelie penguin. And therefore, what seems to happen, and I have a little graph here, which is a bit complex, but this is a 26-year data where you see that these are the anomalies in surface air temperature in the middle graph. And you can see that there has been great variation over these 26 years. On the lower graph is the sea ice extent. If you look at the latitudinal spread of ice, again, there has been a change. And of course, as you can see, the general trend is that the temperatures are rising and the sea ice extent is falling. But see what happens to the penguin colonies. Here you have the Gentoo penguin, and I'm sorry, it's very faint, but you can see that over this 26 years, at least 2 populations of Gentoo penguins are on the rise. Right? So they are doing better because they are generalists. On the other hand, if you look at the Adelie penguin, they are declining, right? So therefore, the same 2 species related, same genus, evolutionarily related, can have very different fates with climate change. So in the last slide, I will talk about very briefly where do we go? What is the kind of science we need to do with these penguins? First, we need to really go back to the past, and previous speakers have spoken about ice cores, trying to understand environmental change in the past. How did past climate change shape the demographic or the population history of these different species, which vary so much in their behavioral ecology and life histories? Remember that this is related. Whatever they experienced in the past is what they have become today. And we need to understand, with the current climate change regime, where will they go? What is their future? Secondly, when you look across these species, how different are their demographic trends? Third, what are the geographical and ecological barriers to dispersal? Remember, this is the most important constraint in the life of the penguin. If you can't go far, then you fall prey to the change that happens in your own neighborhood. How do human activities, both local, for example, overfishing, tourism, pollution, as well as global warming, how do they influence the population dynamics of these different penguin species? Are there interspecific interactions between these species that have just not been documented at all? And how do these interactions, for example, competition for krill, competition for fish, how do these then shape the particular populations of each species is something that has just not been examined at all. And therefore, we need to do a lot. Just to quickly summarize, we need to collect different kinds of ecological data, spatial data, behavioral data. We need biological samples from which we can do genetic and genomic analysis so that we understand not only the population histories of the past, but using this genetic data, we can then design, or we can actually examine population demographic models of the future that will predict how certain populations might be doing. and only then perhaps they will survive into the future. Just wanted to end with a note of thanks. Devapriya Chakraborty is a student with whom I've been talking about climate change a lot. Probir, who's here in the audience, introduced me to penguins. Interestingly, Probir and I and a few of our colleagues have started some work with penguin carcasses that he brought back from his earlier trip, where we are looking at trying to do some brain mapping, looking at the neurobiology. But during his stay there, they also did some work on mirror self-recognition to try and understand whether penguins recognize each other, because there's been absolutely no work in cognition. In fact, this work is perhaps the first where we are trying to understand whether penguins recognize themselves as individuals, because clearly it's important given the kind of complex societies they live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, area that is really crying out for research. It is not just important for the penguins, but it is more important for us, I think. You made the point that, what history they have gone through and what comes out from the examination and research into these ice cores which have been examined. I think the issue really is not that change has not taken place in the ecology, but the adaptation that you are talking about has taken place over millennia.
Yes. And we are outstripping that.
And the danger that we face today is because all that change, very massive change, is actually in a sense encapsulated in a much shorter time frame. And so the ability to adapt is that much less. So we come to the end of an absolutely fascinating set of presentations. This has been really, particularly for me, having been associated with climate change and ecology, this has been a most educative experience. So I would like to thank all the very distinguished panelists here, not only on my own behalf, but all the our members of our audience. Although we have run out of time because we were supposed to finish at 8, what I will do is, with the permission of the members of panel, maybe we can spend just about 10 minutes, if it is okay with you, to just take some questions from our audience. Perhaps a set of maybe 3 questions, because given the amount of time that we have. So I would request you to please raise your hand, identify yourself, and if there is a particular panelist to whom you are addressing the question, please let us know. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for a wonderful session on the Antarctic. Each speaker was absolutely excellent. I have been to the Antarctic. Probably we were contemporaries, Mr. Saran, you on one side of the continent and I on the other, because I visited it on 2009. That was the 1st of November for about 15 days. I was on an expedition cruise. But the geopolitics carried on there. The fight between Argentina and Chile was going on. The British Post Office was issuing its stamps. And then the other thing is regarding the penguins is that the baby penguins like to get into the water very fast and come out because they're surrounded by sea lions. So the sea lions are waiting for them to come into the water so that they can, pluck them out of the water. So that's one of the dangers of survival. Regarding the nesting also, I saw those penguins. They are thieves. When at the time of nesting, they will look around and they will, with their beaks, they will, over their feet, they will roll the boulders and they try and bring it back to the nest. They don't want to go out and forage for anything. They just want to steal from one nest.
Can you please ask your question, because we have very little amount of time.
So the question is just an account of my visit. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. It was really a nice.
Please identify yourself and.
Myself, Jitin Sharma. I am from Ramanujan College, a student of BSc Honors Environmental Studies.
Okay.
So my question is, like, research and exploration in such areas like Antarctica is necessary. I understand that, but don't you think these involvement of humans may create more anthropogenic harms there?
Okay. Any one of you would like to take that question?
Say it's something like that. If you don't go and if you don't study, how will you know what environment you are dealing with? If you are dealing with an environment, you should know the basics of that environment. And it is only possible if you go and if you study that area, right?
Can I just add one point to that? Essentially, what we talk about, the kind of research which we carry out and the environmental impact of it is extremely local compared to the large continent. You're talking about a continent which is nearly about 4.5 times of Indian subcontinent. So we have about 44 stations. So that means you will imagine such a big, large continent. So they will be very basically local. And also Antarctic Treaty insists actually that you have to follow certain rules and guidelines. So that's what more important.
Yeah, if I could.
Yeah, please. Yes. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, so there can be an impact for tourism. At least there can be an impact. Annual, every year tourism, even if it's not landing on the shore, you're going by ship. So it can impact not the scientific activity, like he explained, that the scientific activity is very limited to very small spaces, and they're very careful because there are a lot of protocols that you're supposed to follow. But having said that, there are 76 stations from one station. But there was 1952 1 to now 76. So obviously the footprint is increasing, and these stations are very comfortable. So you can walk around in a t-shirt. So obviously there is a footprint. But having said all of that, it's still very minimal as compared to the tourism population. Now we have to really think in terms of sustainability, for which your question is very pertinent.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, play the devil's advocate and agree that perhaps for some of us, maybe it's not worth going there. And I think an important case study is that of the Andamans, and how other indigenous populations have been really affected by our presence in ways that we did not expect. And so the question is, at what cost knowledge?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Shyam, Mandeep
Yeah.
Soin, mountaineer, explorer, etc. Just a very fascinating evening, I must say. Thank you all. But perhaps a pointed question to Professor Chaturvedi is that where do we go from here? I mean, in terms of, what we need to do as in preserving the Antarctic, do we have to follow a movement like we did with climate change in general and get the civil society to put the pressures on the government? Because I suspect even if we put our, if we can put our sort of hand on our heart and say, are we there for an agenda? That is, when the doors are open in 41 for mining or 49 for the renewal, will we all rush? And if one country makes a mistake, will India hold back, or will we also join the crowd? So, there's a lot of sort of gloom and doom which you look at, and we need to do something proactively. And I find that perhaps the civil society advocacy is at a very low end. And do you suggest that that is something we should all be doing, schools, colleges, etc., etc.? Thank you.
Okay, this is for Professor Chaturvedi, and I see from your bio that you have also been very much interested in the popularization of science. This is something which, I think some of our panelists here are also, in fact, involved in. I think this has always been an issue. How do we, the tremendous amount of work which is being done on the scientific side, how do we simplify it? How do we package it in a manner that can make sense to ordinary people? Because the kind of civil society mobilization that Mandeep is talking about can only happen if that kind of connect is there between the scientific community and the ordinary public. I mean, this is a fairly well-developed effort in, for example, in the United States, I have found, or some of the other countries. But I think in India, it is still rather weak. So what would you have to say about that?
Mr. Chairman, I completely agree with you, and I would like to say that this is an excellent question. We need a new socio-spatial consciousness. We need a movement. We need Anthropocene education. We have to go beyond our disciplinary boundaries. We need to build up coalitions of knowledge production between social and natural sciences. But we also have to acknowledge that science remains the first order value in Antarctica. We still do not know enough about Antarctic, both the continent and the Southern Ocean that surrounds it. civil society involvement is extremely important. And I think what India needs to do is, because India joined the system in order to democratize the knowledge production. We have an Arctic policy. Now we need an Antarctica policy. The sooner, the better. We also need, I think, a polar ambassador who will not only look at the science diplomacy part of it, but who will also work out a blueprint to ensure that this Anthropocene socio-spatial consciousness, in which we look at the two polar regions as the barometers of the Anthropocene, is being introduced at all levels of knowledge production and all levels of education. So I think this is the kind of challenge that India faces.
Yeah, certainly. Sailesh, as somebody who heads a very important institution, which can actually play an important role in this respect, is there something that we can do in this regard?
Yeah, I think it's very important, and Sanjay has very well said that the integration of a social science and science is very critical. But I would go one step further, is the human consciousness about what is happening and what Mandipji said about the civil society. I think our consciousness about the environment, our consciousness about to other biota, I think that is the most important. And unless and until we are able to understand that what is all the earth about, and we are not the only people, I mean, there are other biota, and how we all can remain in a harmony, that is what I think the message is. Today, we are thinking that we can do everything, and we think that we are owning, there was a question, who owns Antarctica? And we think that we own. But I think I like what Gopal Krishna Gandhi has said, that if those people have come together and made a resolution that this is what it should be, I think we should see from that angle, also from the biota angle, that what we are doing to them. So in that sense, we need a scientific knowledge, we need a system, social system, but we also need a human consciousness to really sustain not only the Antarctica, but the planet as a whole.
Yeah. So I would only like to add to that one of the most important changes that has taken place with respect to climate change is that there is a huge involvement of young people in this movement. Why are you mucking up our future? Perhaps we can take a leaf out of that book, and many of the young people who are sitting here, because this is actually your future in a sense. So perhaps I'm very happy that many of you are here, but this is really something which requires a much greater consciousness amongst our younger generation, and also requires them to take a much more active interest in mobilizing opinion on this issue. As we have seen, it is not that Antarctica is somewhere else. Antarctica is very much impacting our lives here, as we are impacting, the Antarctica itself. So if there is that kind of a upsurge of interest and, commitment to really addressing this very great challenge that we are going to be facing, in fact, which we are facing now itself, I think that would be a great contribution. I think we have run out of time completely, but as I said, this has been an absolutely fascinating interaction. So I would like to first of all thank Sailesh ji for in fact, coming up with this idea that we should have this kind of interaction. And I think the interest that has been generated by this bears out the wisdom of your initiative. I would like to thank our lead speaker, Dr. Rasik Ravindra, our other panelists, Dr. Melot, Sulagna Chattopadhyay, Dr. Sanjay Chaturvedi ji, and of course, not the least, the person who had the last word and gave voice to the penguins, Dr. Sinha. Thank you very much, all indeed, for absolutely fascinating evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Moderating so well.